So welcome all to the Death on Screen Film Club. I will do a little bit of an introduction into myself, and then I'll kind of go into the format for today. I'm Dan Vena. I'm a professor. I'm an adjunct instructor at Queen's University in Cataraqui, Kingston, Canada. I'm speaking to you from Cataraqui, Kingston, which is on the territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And I am an uninvited settler on their lands, and I take that role pretty seriously, or I try to move through the world with intentionality, knowing that this land, the land where I teach, live, laugh, and play on, is Indigenous land, and that my work in the institution of Queens and my work in life is to build, decolonize, or to build better relationships, to decolonize, and to take into account my own privileges and positionalities. So I'm really glad to have others in the space kind of acknowledge where they're coming from as well. That's lovely to see. Another thing, as well as being a researcher and teacher at Queen's University, I also recently co-founded and hosted the Witch Institute. The Witch Institute was a project that myself and some colleagues of mine dreamed up, and we hosted our institute last summer, and it's kind of now an ongoing project. The institute itself has been digitized, which is awesome. And if you're interested in any of the work on the Witch Institute, we put a link right there for you. All the panels and sessions we had, almost all of them have been preserved via film, so you could watch them on our website. And we are hoping to do a lot more with that project. If folks in the room want to kind of just say hi, would love to hear from you, and I would love to know where you're coming from, where you're speaking from. I think we're all in perhaps wildly different time zones right now, so not a problem if some are tired, maybe some are wide awake. Would love to hear from you at the moment. So given the kind of intimacy of the group, which is really awesome for this type of exercise, what I wanted to do is actually, I was going to chat briefly about my relationship to death and images on screen using a few examples. After I kind of give a brief little kind of reflection on my own thoughts about death on screen and how images have kind of helped me work through questions of death, dying, grief, etc., I'm going to invite others who are in the room to kind of share their own examples or to discuss films or shows I've already mentioned. And I would love to learn from you which images have kind of helped you in your journey of processing death and dying in your life and world. Now, I've chosen this more kind of group-based dynamic format, not only because I actually really prefer democratizing space. So as a teacher, I really like having others weigh in on topics and conversations because we are all learning together. And I really wanted to create a space where we can share in what types of images have impacted us. And I think I am learning just as much as others as well. I think it's just important to share cultural artifacts that are meaningful to each other so that we can grow and learn from them. And also more pragmatically, or perhaps a little more logistically, my original concept for this event was actually kind of like a screening and a reflection, but running into some problems, not only with screening rights, but also the fact that perhaps if we wanted to show a movie, not everybody could be able to access it depending on where they are in the world. So there were a few little hurdles in kind of focusing on one film or one kind of cultural image. So I thought this actually could be a really unique opportunity to talk with folks who are coming from all over to discuss what kinds of cultural images have impacted them and helped them to kind of learn about this topic. Now, of course, I would love it if we kind of stayed in the session, but I know people are hopping back and forth from other sessions. So if you have to leave the room, not a problem, but I would love it if even before you left, if you could add a few little movie titles or television shows so we could even keep talking about them even after you've left. All right. So I want to begin this conversation with the understanding that we are going to probably talk a little bit more, or at least I will, about fictional or narrative stories. We have a lot of awesome programming in the festival that is very much around documentary cinema, and films that record really real exchanges of the grieving process and or death and dying. And so I want to give space that those films have a lot of value, clearly, but I also want to offer that narrative and fiction film has equal amounts of value, not to hierarchize, but can also offer us interesting insights into our relationship with death and dying. So for me, I understand fictional stories as cultural artifacts. They are architects, or the very architecture of the real itself. We are often in this world kind of working under the regime of the real. We are told what is real, but honestly, everyone's reality is so exceptionally different that perhaps one of our only anchors together is that the dying process is one that will unite us all when we kind of move into another journey in our kind of in our life process. And so for me, I see narrative and fiction film and television and media as part of designing what we understand to be real, as much as it undoes or helps us to challenge what we think is the truth or what is real. As well, I understand. Oh, excellent. Thank you, Chase. We have already a kind of suggestion, Marianne and Leonard, words of love. Um, I would love to have a link to that or learn more about that, because I suspect that's about Leonard Cohen, but I would love to have more information on that. As well, today's event kind of understands images like film, television, and other media as world building strategies. I use this term a lot in my teaching, but for me, images create the world in which we live in, and it could help us to redesign the world in which we live in. The more images we see of things that are possible, the more things that become intelligible or at least visible in the world. And so, as much as I often use this term in thinking about queer, radical world building strategies, I also use it in a way to help us learn things that are repressed or kind of socially taboo, which if you are living in kind of a Western context, certainly the Western context deeply denies and represses the processes of dying, death education, and even any kind of spiritual. Oh, yes. Excellent, Jace. So really, I look to images to offer us alternative possibilities to what the world cannot provide at certain intervals. And so I'd like to do for today's aim is to share some images that have helped on my journey, and hopefully on your journey of death acceptance and death positivity. I'd like to invite others to encounter new images that they can use in their own education, whether that education is formal, so if you're like an institutionalized teacher like myself, or informal. I really like the work of Susan Strigley, who's actually here now at the festival and is presenting with other students as working as death ambassadors. So we all have a role to play in changing the culture around death and dying. And I like Susan's kind of conversation that we as kind of cultural workers could also be death ambassadors. And she has an Instagram account, death.ambassadors, for you to check out as well. And I believe a session at the festival. And if it's possible, I would love to take the suggestions we're going to think about today and collate them into a letterboxed playlist and make that public if we can to help folks in their journeys. So if you're not aware, Letterboxd is a great app. It's kind of a film tracking app. It's almost like a film diary almost. There's no chat function or anything, although folks can leave comments. So it's not really kind of a social media app. It's more kind of a shared community of those interested in film, generating lists or other kinds of reviews or styles of collecting films. And so I thought this could be an interesting opportunity to make a public list on Letterboxd that could help us kind of think about death, dying, grief, etc. And if you haven't explored it already, it's just really fun. You could kind of keyword anything in and see what others have thought about that topic that you're thinking about. So, in general, I'd like to kind of start. Well, I guess we already started, but I'd like to continue with telling you where I'm anchored or kind of situated in my thinking. So, I am an academic and I work at the institution, and I have kind of formal film studies training through my doctorate. And my major research experience has been in horror cinema. And horror cinema to me is not something I've always loved, but something I have grown to love. And often, or that has happened in my kind of academic thinking of it. The more I thought about horror, the more and more I started to like it and what it could potentially offer. Now, today's session is not exclusively about horror, but I do want to kind of at least brag about the genre for a bit because I think it has actually some interesting stuff to offer us. Um, yes, awesome, Wendy. I love the kind of cultural context, but Braveheart, there's a lot of death and grief related images. And these are all great. And I want to kind of keep these titles flowing so then when we get to the kind of broader chat portion of the conversation, we could really kind of maybe dig deep into these. That's awesome. So for me, when I think about death on screen, I go to my training, which is in horror. And horror for me is particularly interesting because it's one of the few mimetic genres we have, a genre that prompts a kind of bodily, visceral experience in which we react in very similar to ways as the characters on screen do. In that when they are feeling fear or terror and they are sweating and the back of their neck, the hairs are kind of standing up, probably so too are ours. We have a kind of bodily or corporal relationship to those characters on screen. And in this way, horror cinema at large tends to remind us that we have a body and reminds us that we have a body that can be that is made very vulnerable by the world around us. And I know this is perhaps not like a particularly amazing revelation, but I speak as kind of I am transgender. I consider myself as kind of having characteristics of Asperger's. And for me, understanding that I have a body and that I'm not just kind of a brain in an orbital jar is very hard often. And for me, coming to terms with the fact that I am a bodily or corporeal subject in the world, that I carry this very vulnerable vessel in the world, is a very hard realization for myself to make often. And so for me, horror is a way to remind myself of my own embodiment, remind myself that I am present and kind of corporal in the world, as much as being corporal in the world has been quite difficult, if not bordering kind of somewhat traumatic. Oh, I don't mind sharing at all, Wendy, but I do think it's a really I think sometimes we all have these very different relations to the body. And I think for me, I often forget I have it. So death and dying often can seem like such an abstract idea because if you are not connected to the body, you are not connected to yourself as kind of a biological shared member in this ecosystem and in this world. And so for me, this is almost like the ground level to death education is embodiment, is our relationship to our own kind of physical selves in the world. And so when we're thinking about, the films that taught us about grief, death, and dying, I would ask if there's films that have prompted you in this space to remind yourself that you too have a body that is worth care and love and attention, and a body that is vulnerable and fragile. And so for me, horror can often do that type of work, but it also does that type of work maybe in the worst way possible because it often reminds us of our vulnerabilities. And for me, as an anxious person, can maybe over remind me as to how vulnerable I really am in the world. And so horror can kind of give a very biased or skewed perception that we always exist in this kind of fragile state, which is not necessarily true. So, a recent film that has kind of done this work. Oh, thanks, Jace. So, yes, and I think the amount of ways in which bodies are judged to me is so antithetical to death positivity. I just recently invited a friend to come to my class to give a lecture on loving fat bodies on screen because I see very much the project of undoing fat phobia as very much part of increasing death positivity, that we all have bodies and that we spend an alarming time consumed by the amount of judgment these bodies will face. And so for me, it seems almost like if we are to do the work of death education and to do the work of thinking about death positivity, we need to spend time also reorganizing the value we place on bodies in the first place. If, as kind of Wendy reminds, hopefully we will one day have the chance to die well and die happy. So this is great. I really appreciate the comments as we're kind of talking through my slides. So one of the films that really reminded me that I had a body, and this is pretty recent, this film, is the film Titan. I will actually copy the link to the trailers into the chat so you could explore the images as I talk. So that link is to the film Titan, which came out this year and actually won the top prize at the Cannes Film Festival. It's directed by Julia Ducournau, who's becoming a very well celebrated filmmaker in horror, but just in cinema at large. It's a French film and is available with English subtitles. It is a very, very provocative film for a number of different reasons. It kind of was billed or publicized as a film about a woman who has sex with cars, and that is not at all a kind of accurate representation of what the film is about. But for me, this film reminded me viscerally that I had a body because so much of the imagery is tethered to the body on screen. There's one particular scene where the protagonist of the film purposely attempts to break her nose so her face will be reconfigured. And the kind of crumpling effect my body did when I was watching her prepare to do that, yes, deeply reminded me that I have a physical form in the world. It's a really, I mean, it's a wonderful film. Perhaps it's not for everybody, fair, but it is a film that is doing at least this work of pointing out embodiment or making us aware of embodiment. The other reason I wanted to bring up this film is that it is part of kind of an ever-growing wave of women working within horror cinema. I think a few years ago, if you asked anybody could you name a woman working in horror cinema? I think people would be really hard to find a name, despite there being actually a number of women directors working in the genre. And it might still be difficult for some, especially some who might not be as close to film as I am and the kind of film circuits as I might be. But we are seeing a lot of kind of stellar award-winning films come from women working within horror, including Titan. And for me, what this wave is doing is making us aware that fear is not it is a genuine and kind of connecting human emotion, but we all experience fear differently. The things that prompt us to be afraid are all different, and thus by extension the ways in which our bodies become vulnerable in the world become different. So fear and death are not equal, and these films are very much looking at the kind of oppressions women's bodies often undergo. And in that, kind of remind us that the processes of embodiment, of fear, of death and dying do not come equally to all. So for me, a film like Titan is quite interesting for not only reminding me about my body, but reminding me about my body as kind of a place in the social and in the political world. Now, another film that's worth mentioning in terms of this kind of new wave of women adding to horror and adding to how these images help us to understand our place in the world and our body's place in the world is the film American Mary, directed by two Canadian twin sisters, the Soska sisters. And it's about a young medical student who quits med school to start to do underground extreme body modification surgeries. Now, there's also a kind of side plot where she kind of starts to avenge her own sexual assault using her medical skill sets. But the clients she ends up performing these extreme body modifications on reminded me of myself to many degrees, in which these are characters who want to alter their image so it looks more to how they understand their themselves. These are characters who their inside does not reflect the kind of appearance they wish to have in the world. And for me, this was a beautiful treatment of the ways in which the kind of surgical or medical touch, if it engages with the body with care, can create a body that is equipped to be in the world, a body that is happy and thriving to be in the world. And you wouldn't necessarily expect that type of kind of treatment in horror, but it's worth mentioning because it has been a film on my kind of journey towards embodiment, death acceptance, death positivity that I thought was worth mentioning. Now, despite that being the case, horror often, I think, also spectacularizes death to such a degree that I don't actually think it's perhaps the best educational tool to help others kind of understand death and dying. For me, I see horror as making death and dying so spectacularized that it kind of does a disservice to the actual real process that we will all have to go through. So it might make us aware of the body, and it might make us aware of the body's kind of ultimate fragility within the world, but perhaps the images become so opaque or so diluted through exaggeration and spectacle that they lose their utility. Now, I had an example I was going to show, but in case folks kind of want a fun, campy, silly example of one of kind of the greatest scenes of death and dying on screen in horror, the link I'm about to post is from the film Hellraiser. Hellraiser was a 1987 American horror film. It is quite a trip. It is about these kind of yes. Is it? I feel like is he in it? Oh my god, Wendy, thank you for reminding me, because I always think of Ron Perlman and so many other, but he is, isn't he? He is, and I always think of him as oh, yes, that's right. That's what I was like, yes, he's Hellboy, but is he also in Hellraiser? And I'm just kinda quickly Googling it, but I don't necessarily see the link. I mean, Hellraiser is perfectly we could use that as a good example film as well. Sons of Anarchy. There we go. I confess I have not watched it, but maybe this is a good show that we could talk about a little bit as well. Hellraiser, which is yes, Kim Coates. Coates. So Hellraiser is not Hellboy, but is an equally interesting horror film about these kind of necro demons that come from the kind of spiritual world of heaven and hell and kind of take people back into these realms. They are demons that inflict pleasure and pain onto individuals, and depending who you are, that pleasure or that pain could be pleasurable, but it kind of depends on the character in the film. And there is a spectacular dying scene in Hellraiser that is like one of the kind of grandfathers of contemporary special effects. So the link I have provided to the YouTube clip is the link of perhaps one of the most spectacular deaths in the movie and in American cinema at large. Now, as I mentioned, it's images like that which perhaps make it difficult to really think about horror as being particularly useful to us when we're thinking about offering. Yes, it is Pinhead. Yes, Wendy. Yes, you got it. Spencer has a great comment about the kind of visceral images of the clip of Hellraiser really triggering viewers' feelings about the body. Great that you learned how to use the chat box, Spencer. It's nice that we could have you weighing in here. And I agree. Like, it's hard not to watch that type of spectacularized death scene and be somewhat kind of viscerally compelled by it. But as Wendy kind of earlierly kind of earlierly agreed earlier on in the chat, that these images also can be perhaps so dramatic and exaggerated that they look nothing like what death actually is, and thus like removes a kind of relationship we could be cultivating towards death and dying on screen. And hello also to Sophie, who recently released a guide on non-religious end of life and are excited to build on it by adding a resource page on death in media. Welcome, welcome. If you missed kind of just the little bit at the top, Sophie, a lot of what I am kind of presenting as images that have impacted me are fictional images, and I have a good reason for that, I promise, and I could explain a little bit more about that if you wish. But a lot of the images I have are thinking about what utility fictional stories can give us, fictional stories that are not necessarily just about exclusively death and dying, but how they could activate kind of related ideas, including, as we're talking about right now, related ideas about embodiment and having a body. So I'm curious to hear from you. And of course, you are more than welcome, anybody, to turn on your video and your microphone. What use might these spectacular images have for helping us to reflect on death? And Spencer had already pointed out that obviously these images allow us to have something, some sort of reflection on us as having a body in the world that we have to care for and ultimately hopefully help to die in a peaceful way. And is there a way, I'm asking, or my next kind of follow-up question, is there a way to integrate these images into death education? Or does horror just kind of give death education a bad name because it can be exaggerated, spectacular, silly, or campy? So awesome, Sophie. And I'm so glad to kind of help support you thinking about what types of media can really help us think about life and the process of death, especially for ourselves and our loved ones. And Wendy, I would love to hear more from you as somebody who also probably works a lot closer to death care than I do, how these kind of images of sensational death do a disservice to the type of education you and others are doing here, because I think you're right. This sensationalizes death, but for me, even a spectacular or sensational death is a call towards thinking about death. But I'm wondering, Wendy, even and others in the room, if you feel that these types of images ultimately, misinform, mislead, or not even prepare us for the actual almost mundane process of death and dying. I suspect in some ways, as kind of Wendy's already hinting towards, that images that thank you, Wendy. Awesome. So I think it could be too graphic. I mentioned Braveheart, and I feel like Mel Gibson would have died much earlier in his death scenes. I agree. So not only are these images too graphic, but perhaps they are also so unrealistic. And there is something interesting, right? Because part of why I think we all love, and I love fictional film personally, is that it is divorced from reality. And Jace is also echoing that this is that this is often the case in film and television as well, right? We'll have characters either meet a very quick demise that no kind of body shuts down in that kind of degree, or often it could be so exaggerately prolonged. Spencer, I love that you love these questions. You don't have much experience watching horror. That's okay. But I also am thinking about making the death scene dramatic is another way of demonstrating the denial of death, because we know in those scenes, because we know those scenes cannot happen in our lives. Absolutely. And I think that's what I'm really interested in kind of learning more about is how horror cinema, which seems to be the most prominent cinema of death and dying, at least in kind of fictional narrative world, yet is also simultaneously very much about denying the realities of death. And this kind of gets me back to the earlier point, right? Where film, yes, and the most realistic scenes can be the most frightening, but we're also, in some ways, Wendy, I feel like we're not even trained, we're not even literate in understanding what real death is and the kind of signs and processes of real death. And also, they're not very cinematic. If we think about the dying process, at least for humans, it's very mundane, such that it's hard to make that visual, and it's hard to make it compelling to a certain degree. I agree, Jace. I think this is, and I've purposely chosen films that are kind of coming from a Western context, because I think the way in which we make art that revolves around death and dying is just a kind of mirror reflection of the ways in which Western, specifically colonial settler culture, is in a greater denial of death than maybe others. So for me, like, I'm coming to the cinema to have an experience that is not real. I don't want more reality. I exist within it enough that for me, cinema is a reprieve. And yet, cinema is also the place where we are educated about the world. And I had a friend recently, we were just chatting, and she kind of casually was just like, oh, well, the only thing I really know about Ireland is what I see in the movies. And honestly, Wendy, that's pretty much me in Scotland, because I've never been to your part of the world. So movies, despite us knowing they're dramatic and perhaps divorced from reality to some degree, still offer us information and still offer us an opportunity to kind of think about these realities. Braveheart was filmed in Ireland. I need to tell her that she needs to rewatch that in order to get her Irish education bumped up a bit. But for me, I'm curious about what horror can do as much as I am curious about what other narrative films can do. So perhaps this is a good time to start sharing with you some of the films that have helped me cultivate an interesting relationship to this topic of death, dying, and grief, and offering you Oh, Wendy. That Scotland was most displeased that Braveheart was filmed in Ireland. Those are cultural politics very foreign to a Canadian who comes from an Italian immigrant family. So I will not even weigh in on those ones right there. Erla, welcome. I don't think I saw an introduction from you. And if you came in late, or not late, but just after we started, feel free to type in just like a little introduction because we would love to get to know you as well. Um, yes. So your question. Oh, another another Canadian on high ground. Very nice to hear. We actually just chatted about that very briefly at the beginning of this session. Sorry, Wendy. It seems that the Canadians are coming to this session. Yes. And so, Erla, just to go back to the earlier point you were making, so in this chat, I definitely don't speak about documentaries in the way we might think about as they're kind of being used in this festival at large. I think we're seeing a lot of really useful documentary cinema that is helping not only the filmmakers, the participants, and the audience kind of grapple with these bigger questions. But for me, I am particularly interested in how creative fictional narrative images serve to be world building. So a lot of the world building, or a lot of what can be possible, I think comes from fictional storytelling. That if we have the capability to create better worlds in our fiction, then we can create better worlds in our realities. So for me, fictional film is actually in some ways even offering more potential to some degree than documentary cinema. And I don't want to hierarchize them, but I'm interested in what the kind of creative impulse can bring to this process. You will see some very graphic images in the slide, like the one you are seeing on screen right now. So if you do have a little bit of a squeamish streak in you, it's totally fine to click on another tab and just listen to my voice and pop in and out when you need. But there is a little bit of a squeamish image on the screen right now. So I started this conversation about kind of learning to be an embodied subject in the world, learning to have a body. And that was the first step towards my own kind of journey of death acceptance and death positivity. And I wanted to share with you other films that have reminded me that I have a body in the world and a body that I need to learn about and take care of, frankly. I think not only do we repress or deny death in our culture, I think we don't even educate about good bodies, about wellness, about happiness, about joy, about being joyful in the body we have. And I think this is another interesting dynamic I want to bring to kind of this conversation. And if there are films that have helped you understand your body in particularly meaningful ways as well, I would love to hear it as in the chat. So some films that you might be interested in learning about are Eyes Without a Face. To me is like a genre defining film. It comes out in 1959 in France and 1960 in America. It's a French film and it's considered one of the first modern or contemporary versions of a medical horror film that we have. There were other medical horror films well before that, but this is the most kind of reminiscent of contemporary medicine as we kind of understand it today. Now, this film is about a surgeon, a doctor, who his daughter has been wildly disfigured in a car accident, or in an accident rather. And so he is trying to perfect a face transplant so that he can transplant a new face onto his daughter. And in doing so, he needs to take victim after victim to practice the surgery. Now, it's famous for this particular still that I have up there on the screen because it was the first time this kind of special effect had been really attempted, which is taking a whole face off and putting it onto another character, which for 1959 is pretty ambitious. And also in 1959, had a lot of people reminded of their bodies because a lot of people actually fainted and vomited in the theater. And fun fact, a lot of people also fainted and vomited in the theater when they were watching Titan, which was a movie I had mentioned earlier in the talk. So when I watched this, you can't kind of really watch that scene, and I know the special effects maybe by today's standards seem a bit hokey, but it's something for me that reminds me viscerally about my bodily configuration in the world. The same for me goes with the horror films Goodnight Mommy and Midsommar, who each have a kind of moment or two in the film where something violent or catastrophic happens to a body on screen that kind of prompts, in fairness, I didn't even really anticipate to have the kind of reaction I did, but my body was very much reacted to what it was seeing on screen. Spencer, I love that. I love the enthusiasm for Midsummer. I got lots of physical reaction. You got lots of physical reaction when watching it. Uh, ah, okay, Sophie. So is my favorite movie. This is awesome. So my partner also. I'm so glad, Erla. Part of my work in this world is to like recover horror that it's actually so totally useful. And this is why I am skeptical about its place in death education as much as I am excited by it if we can contextualize it and ask the right questions of it. So for me, Midsommar, for those who haven't seen it, it is the second kind of feature film from Ari Aster, who also did the film Hereditary. I have a little bit of a vexed or complex relationship with this director. He seems to be fixated on kind of women's trauma in a way that I am curious to learn more as to why that becomes kind of the inciting action in his films. But kind of despite that, it is fair to say that he is quite a master at evoking bodily responses in his films. Midsommar, I find a little more bodily than Hereditary because the images we see are very much about bodies kind of meeting very grim demises. And for me, this is a film that you can't help but walk out of the theater being reminded of your own body, both for the responses it had, but this is almost a 3-hour long film. So whether you're enjoying the film or not, your body is sitting through almost a 3-hour film, and it's going to make or affect you to some degree. And so that's where I think Midsummer is interesting, not only for the pictures it does show of bodies, but how it asks the body to be a spectator. So I am breaking my own little rule here, but I have a good reason for it. So this is perhaps the film that reminded me that I have a body. And this is the documentary Free Solo about the only person to climb El Capitan without any safety equipment. Now, the reason I've chosen to break my own rule set here is that it's actually not a documentary about death and dying technically. So to me, it seems to kind of fall into another realm where you have really a documentary about athleticism, climbing, and the culture of free soloing, which is a culture of climbing without safety equipment. And that is kind of the main focus, and the sub focus is really this person's relationship with his own life. Because, of course, if you're going to be committed to this type of practice, you have to acknowledge the risk you are taking. Yes, Wendy, super high death potential right there. And I believe I have the trailer link for you all if you do want to click onto the trailer as we're talking about it. It is a film, at least within Canada, that you can access on most rental streaming services as well as on Disney Plus. I do not know about our European audiences or our UK audiences. But for me, this was the film that prompted a lot of kind of self-reflection and insight into what my relationship is to my own life, what my relationship is to living a life that is fulfilled despite despite the dangers or risks I may encounter. Now, I am not really living a very riskful life, but it does bring up the question of what is our life worth and what does our dying mean in relationship to it? So, for our main protagonist in this documentary, he very plainly states that he would rather live doing what he loves than living in a way that conforms to social expectation and dying a very mundane or normative death just for the sake of having lived a safe life. And I think that is a very compelling statement. Not all of us may want to be as risk takers as he is, climbing a mountain without equipment on, but it actually does prompt us to think about what it may mean to make the choices in our lives so that we are happy, so that we are being fulfilled, despite what it may mean for death or our death later on or not later on. In fairness, I will say he makes it. He climbs El Capitan. He is totally fine. But the documentary is very, very visceral. So if you have an opportunity, I would really, really suggest watching it. So Erla, yes, just watch the newly released Alpinist. I'll have to compare these films with your insights slash my new thoughts because of the talk. That would be awesome. And at the beginning of the talk, I offered my email address. I will put it again in the chat. But if folks want to follow up with me or to just chat casually about the insights they're having, I would love to do that. I would love to, as I said, compile a list that we can use on Letterbox to kind of help think about death, dying, and the body in media. And I believe, Sophie, that might be your project to some degree. So if you want to send me an email, maybe we could think about using Letterboxd in a particularly successful way to help you and your project as well. The app that I'm referring to, I'll type it into the chat again, is Letterboxd, and it's a film sharing and film community app. So this is another media text that I wanted to talk about in relation to a few others, but I want to really highlight that. So this is the show that taught me that I am in service to those who came before, that partly death education is also acknowledging the work that other people have done to make your life possible and to make your good death possible, or the kind of hopeful reality we have of having a good death. As I mentioned at the beginning of this session, I am transgender. I do identify as queer. And for me, I have to be aware of that my body, my rights are only possible because a group of activists and individuals, mostly women of color, have worked so hard to have trans rights, and to have a space in society and culture. So I wanted to draw your attention to the television show Pose, which is set in the late 1980s, early 1990s, as well as set in Brooklyn and New York, and yes, kind of during the AIDS crisis. But more importantly, or kind of what is the main focus of the show, is the life of a group of trans women and queer men and women in the ball circuit. So balls were a kind of cultural event where people of color, queer people of color, would gather and walk. They would perform different identities. They would dress in different kind of categories, and they would compete to who was able to walk or dress to the category the best. And if you're not aware of this type of culture, you may be familiar with the documentary Paris is Burning, which was a documentary produced in the 90s about ball culture. This television show that I'm talking about essentially fictionalizes the world that you might see in Paris is Burning. And it is spearheaded by Ryan Murphy, who is a white gay creator, but he's also co-working with Janet Mock, who is a mixed race trans woman of color. And she's, I believe, the executive producer on this. And so she has a lot of kind of creative input on the show. Now, there's one particular episode that I really want to draw attention towards, which was season 2, episode 4, where one of the characters passes away. And the entire episode is spent looking or kind of in her funeral. And for me, this was an incredibly emotional episode. This is a character that we kind of have mixed relationships to in the show, but is one that we care about nonetheless. And for me, I see her kind of death or funeral service on the show as a funeral service for the trans women who never got a funeral service in the way they wanted to before. I think if you kind of are new to the kind of politics around trans death, Caitlin Doty, who I follow and I'm sure many of you also follow, did a video on trans rights and death that I would highly recommend. But dying while or as trans is a very complicated thing, especially if people don't recognize your identity. And it's so clear the kind of care and tenderness the community give to Candy in her death and the way in which they ensure she is remembered for who she is. But that's not even why I find this episode the most compelling, although that's definitely a reason. For me, the episode doesn't end with her in a casket. It ends with her performing a musical number, as you see in the image here that I've put on the slide. And for me, this is the image of life that we need to remind ourselves that trans women of color are statistically more vulnerable. They are killed more frequently. They face younger deaths than any trans population. But that is often all we see them as in media and culture. Often they are criminalized, often they are just a statistic, and there is a way in which this episode ends that reminds us of the value of trans life. And if we are reminded of the value of trans life, then we are by default kind of reminded of the value of trans death as well, and the ways in which we are called to work towards more kind of equitable death and death care. And for me, as a queer trans person, this show reminded me that if I am to do death education, then it must be in the memory and service of those who have allowed me to exist happily and freely as a trans person in this world. So for me, if you haven't seen Pose, it's just well worth the watch regardless, but it does have a special place in my own journey as a death educator and as somebody who is continuing, like we all are, to grapple with what it will mean when we pass and what our intention is when we pass. This will be kind of an emotional 360 in some ways, at least the image will be from what I was talking about earlier. But I feel like I tried to pick some filmic examples that kind of showed a journey that I had from kind of the body as kind of historical and only made possible through the kind of other acts of life and death, especially with and by trans women of color. And now I kind of have an example that is about the ritual or the honoring of death, or death as a ritual itself. And for those who haven't seen Coco, I mean, it's a pretty darn good film. It was a film I walked into without not I didn't know anything about it. Yes, Spencer, I agree. I didn't know anything about it, and I cried like a baby, I think, for most of the like second half of the film. There's kind of no way to get through this film without just a stream of puddles running down your cheeks. But for me, I mentioned at the beginning of the session that I am also kind of the yes, awesome, Erla. Great point. A way to discuss death with kids and grandkids. For me, as I mentioned at the start of the session, I had co-founded and run a Witch Institute last summer, and that was a moment where I was kind of thinking about, well, what is my relationship to ritual? And I, as coming from an Italian immigrant family, grew up in the Roman Catholic faith, and it's not one I very much fit into, nor is it really for my parents. It was just kind of this kind of cultural thing passed down to us. And so while I was raised Roman Catholic, at least by an educational system, I went to Catholic school in Toronto, I never really took to it as a way to organize my relationship to life and death, and even to organize my relationship to ritual. And I've been spending kind of the last year, year and a half, really searching for an anchor point in my spirituality. That if I am going to do kind of more death education, and if I am going to learn more about how to be a better kind of death ambassador, as Susan Srigley says, then it also means for me that I need my own healing and processing rituals. And I think I just kind of unconsciously clicked on Coco, and wanted to watch it at a time where I needed something. And now, Coco, for those who don't know, is really about the kind of Mexican Day of the Dead and our main young boy who's searching for his ancestors as he too kind of traverses into the land of the dead. Now, it's not to say that I'm not using this as an example of like now I celebrate Mexican Day of the Dead as a white person, not at all, but it prompted me to reflect on what was possible, what types of rituals were possible for me, what were rituals I could create in a constructive, equitable manner that not only served my own spiritual and personal needs, but also weren't co-opting others as well. And so for me, Coco was the film that reminded me that I needed to create something, that I ought to create some sort of ritual to honor deaths that have happened in my family, but also to create a new way of living that really kept their spirits in me and in my world. So it was the film that prompted me and my partner for the first time to celebrate All Souls Day. Sorry, I was going to say Day of the Dead. No, to celebrate All Souls Day, which technically is a kind of Catholic-based holiday, but is one of those Catholic holiday kind of rituals, festivities that has been co-opted from other pagan holidays. And so for me, it was about constructing a ritual that I thought I could create for myself. Like I could create this world that was borrowing the name from this Catholic ritual, but was really about something more, something larger. So for me, those were the films that I wanted to bring to your attention as having. Oh, I also love the idea of death in the film. Yes, I think it uses a romantic and positive way to help audiences think about death. I agree. And in some ways, I feel like this to me is a really interesting juxtaposition between the way in which death happens in horror than the way that death happens, for instance, in a children's movie, or even other shows like The Good Place, or Dead Like Me, where death has like there is life in death, that we see death as its own kind of realm or reality in which we are still embodied to some degree, still alive to some degree. And I agree that the way in which Coco does it is really positive. But I wonder also if these images of the kind of animated skeletal family members, in some ways that also troubles me, because it 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 prompts me to ask, like, well, is that what I'm expecting? Because I'm trying to do all this type of work to be okay with the end of my corporal life, to be okay with the end of my corporal existence. And sometimes when I watch, especially things, the television show The Good Place, which I will type into the chat here, which is about a show. Oh, yes. So others know The Good Place. And as Sophie is reminding us all that, some really well-known death philosophers and ethicists consulted on it, which shows, like, it's very clear that they know their stuff. But the kind of the image making of death as corporal, to me is really hard sometimes, because as much as it helps me process the larger existential questions, for me, a lot of my journey has been to accept that I am corporal, and that if I accept I am an embodied subject, I so too accept the kind of ultimate demise of this vessel. And so for me, there's kind of this really, I'm torn whether things like that are actually how much they are useful. And perhaps they're useful to us individually in their own unique and spiritual ways. But I really have a hard time with those types of shows that no matter how much I love them, I'm not sure if they're actually helping me process death and dying in the emotional way that I need. So for me, I didn't really expect it, but maybe I want to kind of prompt that maybe horror is somewhere we could start to look. I know they are spectacular deaths, but they are deaths nonetheless, and they are the demise and destruction of the corporal self that at least perhaps prompt us to think about what that may mean for us. Now that we have 15 minutes, I want to kind of open it up. Not that, I mean, the chat has always been open, but if you have any questions for me, I'm really happy to answer any questions. I'm very open about my own journey and my own life. So, really, I don't mind answering anything. Oh, Erla, well, thank you for the compliment. I don't have a podcast. Um, I mean, I created a podcast for the Witch Institute, but it was about witches on screen, and it was really kind of just contained to our Witch Institute conference. If you go to witchinstitute.com, which I am typing into the chat here, you could hear myself and my really good friend and colleague talk about witches on screen. But I am starting to kind of research and think about teaching more about death on screen. And so, in fairness, it's lovely to hear that maybe others are really interested in this, and it's a worthwhile endeavor. Oh, Sophie, great question. Any science fiction films you feel are helpful? Sophie, I'm gonna have to I actually don't see science fiction as different from horror. I think it's like its little young brother in some ways, or like younger cousin or something. And I know that's probably really offensive to science fiction fans, but I'm like, aren't you guys just us too? So for me, I kind of see science fiction as part of it. But if I was thinking about science fiction films in the kind of tech realm, that's a hard one. I feel like the first thing that comes to mind is Minority Report. And I know that's like probably not what you were expecting, but for me, Minority Report is very interesting for the way it plays with time and temporality, and also the film frequency. There's something for me that science fiction does perhaps a little better than horror, is to play with time in interesting ways. So if horror talks to us about what embodiment means, sometimes science fiction, I think, could talk to us about what time means and the fluidity and plasticity of time. Another really interesting thing I like to study is plasticity and our fear of the plastic or the inorganic or something that defies natural conceptions. Because as a trans person, my body seems to defy what people expect to be a natural male body. So I think for me, there is something interesting in thinking about why we have such a cultural fear of plasticity and the unnatural, when plastic itself, the very material, comes from organic substance. So this to me is an interesting conundrum. So Wendy, I've noticed a thread of cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. Do you think we can learn and absorb from other cultures, particularly from films? Yes, absolutely. Like I think, and we are seeing it in the festival, we are learning from all over the world, different cultures and different rituals. And of course, Caitlin Doty wrote a book that was kind of surveying different types of rituals from all over the world. I think that could help us learn about our relationship. I just, myself personally, am very hesitant to like, I think there's a distinction between learning and adopting. And I don't think it's fair to adopt another culture's ritual, but I think we can learn from that ritual. And so in terms of films from other countries, I mean, most of my studying has been in American and Canadian cinema, and with some kind of traversing into French and German cinema. So I'm really kind of grounded in Western contexts, and especially Western contexts that have kind of Christian or Catholic undertones. So for me, if anybody has films from other cultures that they think are like that could help, I would love to hear. Sophie, just following up on the science fiction question, is saying The Lobster. Yes, The Lobster is super interesting. Honestly, it's a film I remember and can't remember all at once. So The Lobster is definitely an interesting pick. I have not seen his film The Killing of a Sacred Deer, but I heard it was not so compelling. Erla, yes, Canadian filmmaker Norman Jewison once said, "Film is this generation's literature." So thank you, Dan. We need to talk about death in films to help create a normalization of death talk. Yes, I absolutely agree. I'm actually trying to convince my friend and colleague to do a course with me for fourth years next year on death and sex on screen. We don't know what to do with it because it's not death and sex. It's like death and sex. We don't really know the language around it, but and there was a talk about sex and death as well at the festival, I believe this morning actually. So for me, there there is something worthwhile in grappling with the social taboo through images, because images help us not only learn about it but process our own experiences towards them. Jace, I think we can learn from films, and I think we have to distinguish between a film made by that culture versus made about that culture. Absolutely. And that is the point. That's a great point about Paris is Burning. I mentioned that documentary when we're thinking about the history of trans death on screen. Paris is Burning was made by a white lesbian filmmaker and making a film about trans women of color for the most part, or queers of color. Pose has a bit of a more kind of complicated relationship than that, and I think Pose is offering something different. Oh, Sophie, thank you. I would love to have people like you take that class. It seems like we are kind of in an agreement about how film works to help us understand culture, but that there is this kind of really political, ethical, and cultural difference between taking somebody's culture and using it as your own, and then, of course, um, doing honor or learning from, or having even the honor of the opportunity to learn from somebody else's culture by watching a film they may make. Just if it's any kind of, if anybody is interested in exploring these films, I'll leave two films in the title. La Irona is a new film. It's, I believe, 2019. It's from Guatemala. It's one of the biggest films to come out of Guatemala, and I believe was actually recognized. I don't know if it was the Toronto Film Festival, but was recognized as an international film. It is actually about the myth of the weeping woman, but the filmmaker has used the myth of the weeping woman to talk about colonization and war crimes in Guatemala. It's a beautiful film. It's very poetic. And if we're thinking about death and dying on screen, it certainly is prompting us to think about mass death. So, death as political atrocity, death as something that happens in in oppressive structures and regimes. So there's La Irona, and then there is the film Dearest Sister, which is, I believe, made by the only woman filmmaker in Laos. She's Laotian and American. She is the first female filmmaker to make a narrative film out of Laos, and it's the first horror film to come out of Laos. Dearest Sister is also an interesting film to think about death and dying and the body. So for me, I'm not necessarily aware of documentaries that come from different cultures about death and dying, but these are two films that are very much on my radar for what they've contributed to horror, and perhaps they will offer interesting contributions to you about other kind of narratives or approaches to how death and dying serve as metaphors for larger cultural traumas. Both of them are very much about cultural traumas of either the West or kind of military dictators within the country. So we're 5 minutes away from our end time. You have all been wonderfully patient for this entire time with me. I want to thank you all for joining me. It was lovely to have a conversation with all of you. I hope I hope you do take seriously the invitation to contact me, because I would love to work on creating a list that creates like a letterbox list for the public to help us do the work of death education in more, not in more, but in another interesting and unique dynamic fashion. Victoria, thank you for having me
Thank
so
you.
much.
So I've gone all soft focus. I'm not sure my camera's having trouble.
It's okay,
It's a
but
different genre. It's a certain genre, isn't it?
yes, we seem to be traversing technology in interesting ways for
Yeah,
this
exactly.
session.
Let's just go with it. It's meant to be. But
Yes.
thank you so much. It's been so fascinating. And
Thank you.
yeah, thank you. I could just listen to you all the time. You need to have a podcast. They're right.
Oh,
You really
I
do.
mean, that's really lovely. I don't think my students might share your same opinion,
Oh,
but
I
they've
don't
listened
think
to
so.
me for 12 weeks now. But you all were so wonderful. Thank you, Joe and Victoria,
Oh,
for the work you are doing.
no
This is
problem.
an
And
awesome opportunity.